Just to remind folks, this meeting is recorded and will be posted to the YouTube channel afterwards. So welcome to the July Deis community meeting. On the agenda for today, we'll touch base, we'll talk about what shipped on with workflow 2.1, and we'll talk through what is on deck for 2.2. We've also got an update coming from the Helm team. They've been hard at work and have cut Alpha 2 and are hard at work on Alpha 3. So we'll see what's on deck there as well. Before I hand everything over to Seth for an engineering update, I wanted to give the community a couple of shout outs. First, a big thanks to Paul Zarkowski for submitting a number of PRs across multiple components to add support for OpenStack's Swift object storage. We've got most of the underlying work merged in the 2.1 release, and the last few bits will ship in 2.2. So thanks for going the extra mile, and I think I actually saw Paul show up. So thanks. Second, shout out to mysterious GitHub user HL70 for submitting a pull request to add IDN support to both controller and router. We love to see features and pull requests coming in from the community. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Seth to talk about workflow 2.1.
Thanks, Jason. I am going to actually paste a link to a blog post that outlines the workflow 2.1 deliverables, and you can read through those at your leisure. I'll kind of walk through each of them and give you a quick rundown of each of them. We added AWS instance profile support, so components can acquire AWS credentials for roles automatically. We also added some support for off-cluster Postgres. So this gets us closer to a fully stateless Deis workflow cluster if you so chose to go that route. We've had off-cluster storage support, and now this is off-cluster database. So if you don't like Postgres in cluster, as could be fraught with peril, you have another option to go with if you wanted. We also added the ability to supply and tweak your own application health checks in when you deploy an application into the Deis workflow cluster. There's some documentation on that, and I will post that as well into chat. Which is kind of neat. It's like the Kubernetes way of adding liveness, readiness checks, but in a Deis-centric way. Then we also had some work to add Windows CLI testing, and we're now actually making sure when we ship each version of Deis workflow that the client can actually run properly on Windows. So a shout out to our Windows users, hopefully a growing community. We also made some changes to Deis workflows logging and monitoring architecture. To discuss what sorts of changes we made and why, I'll hand it over to Jonathan Chauncey, who has been in the south soaking up some rays. So you'll see a nice tan. Oh, and now he
there it is. There it is.
I thought you were going to turn like witness protection program style on us. Anyway, take it away.
Yeah, so with the release of 2.0, we shipped the kind of a simple monitoring stack. And one of the things I realized rather quickly was there was some bottlenecks in how we transmit the data from various parts of the cluster to other parts. So the way it's set up right now is you have Telegraph, which is a product created by the Influx guys, which collects host metrics and Docker information. It also pulls the Kubernetes API for metrics out of Kubernetes. It bundles all that information up and it ships it across the wire to Influx directly. But then we wanted to collect metrics kind of internally about the router and other components. So we started collecting metrics out of the router, which meant we needed to process Nginx logs. So we wrote these components to do that, but there was a bottleneck in how fast it could actually process. So if we tried to, say, escalate the number of requests per second on a cluster to 1,000, it couldn't keep up processing that log data quick enough. And the component wasn't really scalable. So over the last couple of weeks, and with the 2.1 release, we shipped a kind of a re-architect of that. And it also brought a new architecture in for Logger as well. So we we kind of inserted in the middle of that system NSQ, which you're probably familiar with. It was written by Bitly originally. It's a distributed messaging system where we only have one instance of NSQ actually running, but it allows us to kind of buffer the data. So we can push data onto NSQ as fast as we can write it. And then we have consumers, on the backside that can pull that data off. And we're working on being able to scale those consumers horizontally. For instance, right now, Logger is not horizontally scalable, but some upcoming releases will allow us to say scale Logger to fit the demand of a cluster, so it can pull data off as quickly as possible. So those are the kinds of things we're kind of working on, all in an effort to make sure that the customer can see what's actually happening within a cluster. We're shipping updated graphs to kind of give you more information into the cluster. We have router metrics now, like how many requests per second are you seeing, the status codes, the response times, and things like that, which are really important. I also created a dashboard for NSQ itself, so you can see how much data is in NSQ, is it backing up, and things like that. So this is a big effort for us to kind of move forward and kind of create a distinguishing mark of, like, we give you guys a monitoring platform that really works and is scalable out to potentially hundreds of nodes, and there's not much you have to do with it. I'd like to give a huge shout out to Shane Starcher. He is kind of my go-to guy. He has some pretty big production clusters I let him throw heavy workloads at, so he's given us some good feedback.
All right, thanks, Chauncey. Sorry, it took me a while to get my finger on the trigger of the unmute button. And I want to move us into the world a little bit on what we're doing for 2.2 and some features that dropped for 2.1 that we're continuing to improve and will be a little bit more documented and public in 2.2. So for that, I will hand it over to Jack Francis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Francis. I'm a software engineer on the Deis team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a new component with version 2 called Workflow Manager. So Workflow Manager is meant to be a catch-all component for managing cluster lifecycle over time. And we have a few sort of high-level objectives that we've come up with that we're going to be implementing over the coming months. I'll list a few of those examples. So for example, we're thinking about submitting cluster status data to Deis support. So this is something that we're calling Deis Doctor. So for example, Workflow Manager will have knowledge of a Deis cluster and its relationship with its Kubernetes cluster, and we can package all that information up, ship it over on demand to Deis support team, where we can more easily get visibility into a cluster's state to help during various problem situations. Some other examples are that Workflow Manager would be able to periodically monitor and log expected cluster behaviors or expected error conditions or warning conditions. It could then alert Deis support if an admin of a Deis cluster chose to do so. We could also potentially put an interface into Workflow Manager that could be exposed to Deis support for real-time troubleshooting. And in 2.1, we rolled out an initial feature of Deis Doctor, basically a little executable wrapper inside the Workflow Manager pod. So if you kubectl exec against that pod, you can pass in Doctor, and it will send a very simplified representation of the Deis cluster as we know it right now, components, version data. So we've got that kind of under the hood. In 2.2, what we plan on doing is increasing the fidelity of the data that we're sending to Deis support, so we can actually see more about what's really going on in the Kubernetes cluster. I think that's a good intro to Workflow Manager and Deis Doctor. Should I pass back to you, Seth?
Cool, yeah, great rundown of that work there. So as Jason already touched on, in 2.2, we're also going to have the Swift object storage support from Paul and our mysterious contribution for international domains. We're also working on using Kubernetes deployments in Deis application deployments. So bubbling up the functionality and the usefulness of Kubernetes up into the Deis workflow level to make less maintenance burden for us and hopefully add more robust functionality available to Deis users. We also are going to, and have actually working, a way for us to use Kubernetes Helm, the new incantation of Helm, which is a server client model, to install workflow. That should be neat and kind of bring us into the new world there. And then some other functionality that we may get to is using native registries instead of the Deis registry in cluster. So ECR and GCR storing your images instead of the Deis registry in cluster. And then since we're in the world of using the new Kubernetes Helm, I want to pass it off to Michelle, who's going to talk about some advancements in the core Helm functionality that that actually makes us able to use Kubernetes Helm in workflow.
Thanks, Seth. So yeah, we're happy to announce that we released Helm Alpha 2 about 2 weeks ago, and now we're about halfway through the Alpha 3 mark, So some major updates from Alpha 2 are the Tiller server-side component of Helm can now be installed into any namespace, not just the Helm namespace. The values file is now in YAML format, and we no longer support TOML. Templates have lots more functions. We use Sprig, the Sprig library for that. And we still have some big changes to the template system, but if you want to see the latest on what's going on, check out the Nginx example chart in the repository. We're also supporting .helmignore files, which are similar to .gitignore files. And the linter has gotten a major overhaul thanks to the folks over at Bitnami. As always, we're looking for contributions, so check out the Kubernetes Helm GitHub repository if you'd like to help on that or give us some feedback. Alpha 3 has some exciting features to look forward to as well. We're working on being able to upgrade charts. We just added support for hooks, so we'll support pre and post install, upgrade, and delete hooks. These are probably most commonly going to take the form of Kubernetes jobs that you can kick off before or after a particular action. So again, for an example of that, check out the Nginx example chart. We'll also have Tiller manage multiple namespaces. We'll use config maps for storage of Tiller data. And we're also working on setting up the official Kubernetes chart submission process. So those are things to look forward to. We're really chatty as a group in the Helm channel on the Kubernetes Slack. So come say hey. We'd love to see how you're using Helm or get your feedback. And we also have a public Helm developer call on Thursdays from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific. So if you want to reach out in person, that's where to do it. That's all I got.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Appreciate the update on what's going on in Helm land. Before we wrap it up, does anyone have any questions? Open the floor. If not, it's been great to see everybody hanging out on the channel. A lot of good questions being asked, and the thing that we really like to see is everybody helping each other as well. So thanks for pitching in there. Our next community meeting is going to be Thursday, August 4th at 11 a.m. Pacific. So see everybody then. Thanks for stopping by.